When I was younger, I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house. I remember countless nights that I slept there, and every single morning I was greeted by the same sight. My grandfather would be filling in the daily crossword puzzle of the newspaper. Now, at the time, I was too young to possess the trivial knowledge to help him, and I also didn't have any interest in politics, so I instead turned to a different section of the paper, the comics. The comic strips, they captured my attention because I liked the art style and the characters, and while the jokes didn't really appeal to me that much at the time, whenever one of the characters got hit over the head and forced me to laugh, it was just kind of like an added bonus. And for the longest time, this was really all that comic strips were to me. Just some pretty pictures to look at until something more interesting caught my attention. Interestingly enough, the same grandfather reintroduced me to comic strips a few years later. I was sitting on the couch when he handed me a book. This book, The Authoritative Calvin and Hobbes. Intrigued, I opened it and flipped through the book to see pages upon pages of comic strips. I thanked him for the unique gift, and within minutes I found myself lost within the world portrayed by these 1.5 by 2.5 inch rectangles. Oh my gosh. However, with the decline in the popularity of newspapers, comic strips are becoming less and less popular. Oh, sorry, I just have something in my throat. Yes, please. Can I? Thank you.
Take note, guys. Have some water on the third.
Okay, however, with the decline in the popularity of newspapers, comic strips are becoming less and less prevalent. Calvin and Hobbes, along with other iconic comic strips, are really being acknowledged by people who seek to enjoy them, and I think that's tragic. In a society obsessed with fast-paced action in movies, books, and video games, comic strips are losing their appeal. However, I believe that comic strips can still provide enjoyment to people through their unique storytelling, humor, and the art styles. So firstly, over 1 to 4 panels, comic strips achieve two things: tell a story and make the audience smile or laugh. Unlike other forms of media, the comic strips are limited in how they can tell the stories because of the space provided. To get over this, the comic artists use the 3-act story structure. And while this 3-act story structure prevents comics from telling epic tales or stories of adventure, they can still tell a story for a short amount of time. This 3-act story structure can transform a mundane situation that most comic strips can portray into an interesting scenario, and they do this by providing context within the first few panels, conflict either through dialogue or an action that the character experiences, and finally a conclusion, which is usually which resolves the conflict in either a witty or sometimes unexpected manner. So to demonstrate this first point, I have this comic right here, which is Peanuts, and so in this first slide, it's setting the setting of the comic. So as you can see Snoopy and his Beagle Scouts, and he's telling them to go over their names. And then the conflict comes in when he hears someone's name that he doesn't recognize. And so the conflict is that he doesn't know who this is and why should they be invited to join their group. And finally, the conflict is resolved because the new person brought food, which everyone can relate to, and that makes them part of the group. So this story structure is very integral to comic strips because it allows them to tell a story over in a concise and efficient manner. So after they can tell the story, they move on to the joke. And the comic artists, to tell a joke, they use two main types of humor: slapstick and satirical humor. So slapstick humor is the inclusion of exaggerated physical movements or features as well as some minor violence cases. This is effective in the restrictive panels of comics because they can make their audience laugh with very little setup to the joke, as well as because their drawings, characters can easily be portrayed in wacky or crazy scenarios. This type of humor appeals to multiple different audiences because, again, there's no background knowledge needed to laugh at something funny happening to a character. So looking at this comic, it's a perfect example of the slapstick comedy because this minor violence right here when Calvin slaps Hobbes in the head to try and knock the horsefly off, it's an example of, again, the minor violence and the exaggerated physical features. And the joke comes in when Hobbes tries to get his comeback on Calvin for hitting him in the head and missing the horsefly. Another type of humor that comic artists can utilize is satirical humor, where irony or sarcasm is apparent in the comic. Often this relates to a topical issue at the time, politics or maybe society as a whole. Satirical comedy can easily be enjoyed by much older audiences because it's usually a more subtle joke. However, comic artists can also intertwine some elements that kids might enjoy so that all audiences can enjoy this type of humor. So this comic is an excellent example of this joining of the types of humor. We're talking in a sense kind of politics because in the Calvin Hobbes strips there's a running joke of his dad running for office of the position of the father. And this relates to politics again because it's like running for an elected position, as well as relating to issues that kids can relate to, like later bedtimes, expanded TV privilege, and shorter school weeks. So again, using these types of jokes, comic strips can still provide entertainment through humor to many different types of people, even though the space of the comic might be limited. Finally, the last element I would like to focus on today is the art of comic strips. While the art of many comic strips is extremely simplistic, its importance cannot be overstated. Comics use pictures to show a story instead of telling one. And this is an experience not found in other text-based mediums. A comic uses these sequential drawings as well as the dialogue to progress the story, but also to immerse the reader into the world portrayed by the comic. With such short events being portrayed, art is necessary to capture the audience's attention and portray the action of the character. So for my primary research, I sent out a survey and had people record their responses and how they felt about certain comics. And so as you'll see, I had them look at 3 separate comics. And comics that were said to be more aesthetically appealing also got higher ratings on what the people thought of the comic. So again, a lot more people enjoyed this comic, and the ratings were generally higher, trending around 3 or 4. However, as the art style, as more people found it less aesthetically appealing, as you can see in this infographic, that the data is starting to move to the right, which means that people are rating the comic a lot less in terms of enjoyment. And finally, this comic that they found the least aesthetically appealing, most people found it to be around a 1 or a 2, which is a lot less enjoyable than the previous comics mentioned. As you can see, comic strips can contain humor, storytelling, and art, much like many other forms of popular media. Why then are comic strips so much less popular? While millions of people may enjoy films or novels, comic strips are only enjoyed by those select few who still read papers, or for those who've been handed down these handy collections of comic strips like this one. While comic strips may only hold your attention for a short amount of time, I implore you to look into the subtleties of the drawing, jokes, and action. What you find may just surprise you. Thank you.